If you feel your heart growing hard, listen to this story. In the corner of an old stone house, there lived a lone cat named Ben. He was a small grey tabby with emerald green eyes that glowed like polished leaves in the sunlight. Ben's life was simple. He wandered the neighborhood, greeted by the occasional chirping of birds and the flutter of butterflies in the gardens he explored. He had no owner, but local children often left small bowls of milk for him, drawn to his gentle nature and inquisitive spirit. Though he'd seen both kindness and indifference in the world, Ben's heart remained soft and open, filled with a quiet, unwavering joy. Every day, Ben would amble through the nearby gardens and bask in the warmth of the sun, soaking in life's little pleasures. Despite his solitude, he was far from lonely. To Ben, every flower, tree, and creature he encountered felt like a friend. The world was vast, but Ben welcomed its unpredictability, trusting in the goodness he often found. Then, one day, everything changed. A new resident moved into the house next door, someone unlike anyone Ben had encountered before. He was a tall, elderly man with a stern face and eyes that seemed as cold as stone. The neighbors called him Mr. Walter, a man of few words who never smiled and barely greeted those around him. His presence seemed to cast a chill over the usually cheerful neighborhood, and the neighbors whispered among themselves, wondering what secrets weighed down his heart. When Mr. Walter noticed Ben near his door for the first time, he reacted by slamming it shut, showing no interest in the curious feline. But Ben, ever hopeful and unafraid, was intrigued. There was something about Mr. Walter's cold demeanor that drew him in, perhaps because Ben sensed a story behind the man's silence. Day after day, Ben began to approach the stone house, making himself visible to Mr. Walter, hoping that with patience and presence he might warm the man's icy heart. One rainy morning, Ben found himself sitting at Mr. Walter's doorstep, his fur dampened by the drizzle, waiting for a hint of kindness from the man who had ignored him so persistently. As Mr. Walter opened the door, his face twisted into a look of irritation. He stepped forward and waved Ben away with a sharp, dismissive motion, muttering harshly as he did. Ben recoiled, startled and hurt by the rebuff. This was the first time Ben had faced such cold rejection, and the sting of it left him bewildered and a bit afraid. What had he done to earn such unkindness? Ben retreated to a sheltered spot in the garden, curling up under a large bush as he tried to make sense of Mr. Walter's bitterness. The rain fell softly around him, and he listened to the rhythmic sound, letting it soothe him. He had always believed that everyone, no matter how stern, had a spark of warmth inside them, waiting to be uncovered. But Mr. Walter seemed different, his heart sealed tight, as if it had never known kindness. Ben felt an ache deep within, unable to understand why some people were closed off to simple affection. For the next few days, Ben kept his distance, nursing the hurt of that morning. He stayed near the other houses, receiving gentle pats from the children and comforting words from neighbors. Yet even in the warmth of their affection, Ben couldn't forget Mr. Walter. He watched the man from afar, seeing him walk briskly around his yard, tending to his garden in silence, speaking to no one. Though the rejection lingered, something within Ben urged him to try again, to find a way to reach Mr. Walter's hidden heart. After a few days had passed, Ben felt a quiet resolve settle in his heart. Despite the rejection he had faced, he was determined to give Mr. Walter another chance. On a calm morning, with the sky clear and the air crisp, Ben once again approached Mr. Walter's door. He moved slowly, his eyes warm and inviting, and finally settled himself down by the doorstep, curling his tail around his paws as he waited. To Ben's surprise, when Mr. Walter opened the door, he didn't chase him away immediately. The old man stopped in his tracks, his gaze fixed on the little grey cat sitting at his door. For a moment, neither of them moved. Mr. Walter's eyes softened slightly, a faint curiosity flickering behind them. Instead of shooing Ben away, He let the door rest half open, standing quietly as if lost in thought. Ben took this as a silent invitation, closing his eyes and beginning to purr, a gentle, comforting sound that filled the still morning air. Mr. Walter watched, his expression unreadable as Ben's gentle presence began to fill the empty space between them. Though he was silent, there was something different about the way he looked at Ben, a subtle shift, as if the simple act of sharing the morning with another being had struck a forgotten chord in him. The cat's quiet persistence had managed to chip away at the walls Mr. Walter had so carefully constructed around his heart. That morning, for the first time in years, Mr. Walter found himself lingering by the open door, a warmth spreading through him that he couldn't quite explain. Ben remained, his soft purrs a steady reminder of companionship and trust, patiently waiting for the day when Mr. Walter might open his heart a little more. As the days went on, Ben continued his quiet visits to Mr. Walter's doorstep, each time bringing with him the same patience and warmth. Little by little, the hardened man grew accustomed to Ben's presence. Though he never acknowledged the cat directly, he stopped closing the door so hastily, letting it remain open just a crack, as if he had grown curious about the loyal feline that refused to leave him. One afternoon, as Ben sat on the doorstep, Mr. Walter caught himself looking out the window, his gaze following the small grey cat as he basked in the sunlight. A memory stirred within him, faint but persistent, of a time when his heart hadn't been so closed off. He couldn't quite place it, but he remembered feeling something similar to what he felt watching Ben, a quiet peace he had long since forgotten. That same afternoon, Mr. Walter finally stepped outside, moving slowly as he approached Ben. The cat opened his eyes and lifted his head, his green eyes meeting the old man's with a calm, unwavering gaze. Hesitantly, as if unsure of himself, Mr. Walter reached out and gave Ben a gentle stroke on his back. The softness of the cat's fur surprised him, and Ben responded with a contented purr, leaning ever so slightly into the touch. For a moment, Mr. Walter felt a crack form in the armor he had built around his heart. Something about Ben's quiet, unassuming presence was disarming. In a life where he had allowed himself few joys, the companionship of a stray cat was an unexpected comfort. Ben's acceptance and gentle spirit stirred emotions he thought he had long buried. From that day, he found himself reaching out to Ben more often, discovering that maybe, just maybe, his heart was not as hardened as he once believed. In the following weeks, Mr. Walter's routine began to change, almost without him realizing it. He found himself looking forward to Ben's visits, his heart softening a little more each day. The once stern man, who had lived so long in his own solitude, now felt the weight of loneliness lift, replaced by an odd sense of warmth. And it wasn't just Ben's presence that made the difference. It was the quiet, unwavering way the cat offered his friendship, never asking for anything in return. One morning, Mr. Walter sat on the porch, a small dish of milk by his side, a gesture he once would have dismissed as foolish. Ben approached, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the milk. As he lapped up the treat, Mr. Walter allowed himself a small smile. It was a smile he had not felt in years, rusty but real, as he watched the cat enjoy his modest offering. Over time, the neighbors noticed Mr. Walter's small transformation. The man who had once avoided conversation now nodded politely as he passed, occasionally exchanging a few words. And while it was subtle, people could see a change in his face, an ease that hadn't been there before. It was as if Ben had unlocked a part of him that had been hidden for too long, a door he hadn't dared open since loss and hardship had hardened his heart. Ben had become more than a visitor. He was a reminder that affection could be shared without words, that kindness could exist even in the simplest acts. Each morning, as Mr. Walter set out the milk and stroked Ben's soft fur, he found himself remembering moments of joy he'd once forgotten, buried beneath the weight of life's struggles. With Ben's companionship, Mr. Walter discovered that perhaps he was ready to let go of the past, to forgive himself and embrace a gentler way of living. Day by day, Mr. Walter's heart continued to open, transforming in ways he never thought possible. The man who once moved through life with a stern, closed expression now looked at the world with gentler eyes. He found himself spending more time outdoors, watching Ben chase butterflies or sunbathe, his graceful movements a simple reminder of joy. The once hardened man felt a newfound peace simply by being near the cat who had so quietly and persistently broken down his walls. One afternoon, as Ben curled up beside him on the porch, Mr. Walter did something he hadn't done in years. He spoke about his past. Though he knew Ben wouldn't understand his words, he felt an ease in opening up to the little cat. He talked about the loved ones he had lost, the dreams he had abandoned, and the regrets that had weighed him down. And as he spoke, he felt something lift, as if sharing his burdens, even with a silent friend, was healing a part of him he had long ignored. Ben listened with quiet understanding, his green eyes full of a warmth that needed no words. "Mister." Walter reached down, scratching the cat behind his ears, feeling a comfort he couldn't quite explain. For the first time in years, he felt less alone, not just in his home, but in his heart. Ben's gentle presence had become more than companionship. It was a reminder of resilience, of how even the smallest acts of kindness could mend what felt broken beyond repair. By evening, Mr. Walter felt lighter, a quiet resolve blooming within him. He realized that his life didn't have to remain bound by his past pain. It could grow in new, unexpected ways. Ben, a simple stray cat, had shown him that no heart was truly too hardened to heal, and that sometimes the smallest presence could rekindle the will to live with love and openness. With Ben by his side, Mr. Walter's transformation became evident to everyone around him. The neighbors watched in quiet amazement as the once cold and distant man began greeting them with warm nods and even occasional conversations. He spent more time outdoors, his expression softened, his eyes no longer filled with the bitterness that had once shadowed them. Ben had become his faithful companion, a presence so subtle yet powerful that it had melted a heart many thought too hardened to change. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves, Mr. Walter looked down at Ben with gratitude. "Thank you, old friend," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Ben's eyes met his, and with a soft purr, the cat pressed against his hand, a simple gesture of love and understanding. In that quiet moment, Mr. Walter realized just how deeply the little stray had changed him. Ben hadn't come into his life to demand anything. He had simply offered his companionship, and in doing so, had given Mr. Walter something he hadn't felt in years, a reason to believe in kindness and connection once more. The story of Mr. Walter and Ben soon became known around the neighborhood, a tale of patience, companionship, and the quiet power of love. Those who knew Mr. Walter could hardly believe the change in him, and many found themselves inspired by the bond between the man and his cat. Ben, the unassuming stray, had taught not only Mr. Walter but everyone around him a lesson about resilience and hope, that even the hardest hearts could soften when met with gentle, unwavering affection. Conclusion and moral. If you've ever felt your heart grow hard or lost touch with the kindness within, remember that even the simplest gestures of love can rekindle the warmth inside you. Just as Ben did for Mr. Walter, let this story remind you that no heart is beyond healing and no spirit too broken to find hope again. Thank you for joining us in this story. Share it with someone who might need a gentle reminder that kindness can truly change lives.